Folks, just message me if there's a problem. But first of all, what a pleasure to see this this gallery view of my personal history. Last we all met, we were all young people, and now some of us have met in between, but 30-something years later, it's quite incredible to see everything that every one of you has accomplished, and also to see us all well and healthy and sort of keeping in touch. It's very moving to me. I was saying earlier that I'm wearing the IIT Kanpur t-shirt that Alok Sharan got for me. I want to say a couple of things. One is, this is something I said to one of my colleagues at MIT the other day. I said that I've been at MIT for 25 years. It's a long time, after IIT, I bounced around. Sanjay Subhash and I were at Schlumberger, and then I went to CMU in Berkeley, and then I came here. So what I was saying to my colleague is that, and I can say this sort of without any doubt, I have never in my life come across the same level of sizzling intellect ever that I, compared to IIT. Just in terms of the Vineet Guptas, the Vigyan Singhals, the Kumud Sanwals, the Ram Keys, all of you. I've never seen that. Maturity is a whole other story, okay? But in terms of sheer horsepower, it is, to this day, I have not come across that level. The other thing I want to say is thank you to Vishwaranjan and to Vishwa and to Sandy for hosting this. It's also quite extraordinary that, as Vishwa said in the WhatsApp yesterday, that we're doing this. I'm an IIT guy. I'm doing it for our IIT friends, and we're doing it on an IIT platform. That says a lot, and I think this is a great platform. So with that, with no further ado, let me jump into this. So my talk is going to be about rethinking education in 2021. And I like to joke. I say that the 21st century didn't begin in 2000. It just began, because we are confronting a brand new reality as of today. Okay, so today, now we're in the midst of the beginning of the real 21st century, because everything has changed. So this was triggered by actually Rohit posting on the group, on the WhatsApp group, that I have a book coming out. It's called GRASP: The Science Transforming How We Learn. And what I'm going to talk about today is the science of learning, and it's telling us things and what we should listen to. And it's pertinent to this IIT crowd, because we're all sort of parents. We were at one point children. Learning is in our life. It's our lifeblood. This is what defines us. But if you look at education going back 1,000 years, this is a lecture from the 13th century, 14th century. And if you look at it, nothing has changed in 14th centuries to some extent, right? I mean, you can see the lecturer is giving a lecture from a podium. One dude is sleeping, which was probably me in IIT. Someone's looking at their iPad, right? Two guys are gossiping. Nothing's changed, literally in 1,000 years. But something's changed, and what happened was that we used to have a conception of what learning was, but somewhere along the way, a convenient assumption was made. And the convenient assumption is this, that the teacher has a pen, the student's mind is a sheet of paper, and the teacher writes on the student's mind. That's it. And then you can declare victory. And unfortunately, this is the trap that education has been in 1,000 years. And it got baked in during the Industrial Revolution, because suddenly you had all these people coming in from the country to work in factories, and you had to train them to work in factories and take care of their kids. So they just put the factory model in, and that's our education system today. And it's we treat it as if it's sacred, and it really comes from industrialized Europe. And I tell you, the crazy thing is, the people who treat it the most sacredly are the colonial countries, which are the victims of that system, because they were trying to train the clerks, So, and yet we stick to it as if it's God's gift. So, when I was in IIT, I studied hard to get into IIT, but when I got to IIT, I completely lost interest in education. Some of you may recall. The moment I left IIT, I went to Schlumberger. I suddenly began to things started clicking for me. And then when I went through grad school, I became a researcher. I became a teacher. And over the last 10 years, I've been thinking about the science of learning because I'm the vice president for open learning at MIT. So in addition to being a professor, I lead a lot of the online activities at MIT, which right now is very much, it's become a sort of a very important thing, obviously. So what I'm going to talk to you now about is how the brain works and how learning works. Okay, let me start with this. So the first thing to think about is that knowledge comes to us like little coins, fistfuls of coins. Every little conversation, we get knowledge. Our brain wants to organize the knowledge like the picture on the right, like a khajana, well organized. This knowledge fits here. Of course, this is not a complete analogy because you have cross-links, you file things, you give it different attributes, you look for patterns, etc., etc. And in between, what happens is our brain. And really what happens there is that our brain has an agent. It's actually the prefrontal cortex of the brain. That's why in India, Hindus wear a bindi, right? In a lot of cultures, we know that this is important, right? We call it the third eye. By the way, it's very interesting. Religion picks up intuitively a lot of stuff that education has picked up. Tradition picks up a lot of stuff that education is ignored. So this prefrontal cortex is the most recent evolutionary aspect of the brain. Animals don't have it. It lets us plan. It's a CEO of the brain. So it goes in, when knowledge comes in, it shuts everything down and figures out what to do with it. That prefrontal cortex, I show him as a leprechaun here. And what that guy does is he takes the coins, the little nuggets of knowledge, and reforges them and organizes that information and integrates it and then stacks it away in the khajana. That is really how our brain works. Now, here's the crazy thing. The crazy thing is, the mistake that the education system makes is, it doesn't recognize the humanity of that little leprechaun. And what I mean by that is, we ignore that piece. We assume it's a pipe. You just throw stuff in, it comes out at the other end. But actually, that little leprechaun, the third eye, the prefrontal cortex, what that guy does is, it's very heavy lifting for that guy, right? And that guy, what does a leprechaun do when he gets tired? Well, he goes to sleep, all right? So that guy, after 10 minutes, shuts down. That's the profound thing. He shuts down. And I want to tell you something related to various traditions here. The basic thing is what I said earlier. The mind is not a sheet of paper that the professor is writing on. What the professor can only appeal to is the prefrontal cortex and our visual system. But the prefrontal cortex then has to digest information and put it in the back. Now, that is called cognitive load theory. So basically what it turns out is that the prefrontal cortex, the little leprechaun guy, he has that bowl behind him with the gold coins. That is like the RAM of your brain. It's not the disk. The disk is the khajana. That's the RAM. And the crazy thing is that RAM is very limited. 10 minutes. 10 minutes. And after 10 minutes, what happens is that the prefrontal cortex shuts down. Okay? And the brain goes into a mode called mind wandering. Literally, that's a technical term for it. Actually, the more technical term for it is default mode. Okay? And what happens is the brain gets into the mode of connecting the dots. The thoughts sort of bounce around. By the way, I want to tell you something very interesting. That default mode, you can actually see it in the brain. You can see it in a functional MRI. When it's focused, you can see the attention is here, and it's going up and down the brain. But when it go in the forehead, right? But when it goes into the mind wandering mode, right? It's all over. Mind wandering is where the brain integrates, it's creative, etc. We reject it as daydreaming, but it's very important. By the way, uncontrolled mind wandering, uncontrolled, when you lose control of it, leads to things like depression because you ideate on negative thoughts. And you know the only way to control uncontrolled mind wandering? Mindfulness, meditation. ladies and gentlemen, meditation, we now have proof, works, because it shuts down the uncontrolled mind wandering, and returns power to the CEO of the brain, which is your prefrontal cortex. It's fascinating what we're learning. But here's the crazy thing. You can only pay attention for about 10 minutes. You can absorb for 10 minutes. Beyond that, you are doing something worse than learning. You're creating the illusion of learning. It's a false confidence that actually makes things worse. And over the last 100 years, people like Maria Montessori, Emerson, Thoreau, here in Boston actually. Montessori, by the way, was an Italian lady. By instinct, she said, this is not right, and she created the Montessori system. By the way, when World War II broke out, Montessori was in India, Maria Montessori, and she was Italian. So she was put under country arrest. In other words, she could stay in India, but she couldn't leave. And so the result is a bunch of Montessori schools in India. We benefited from that, which fought back against the British system of the school, which is very regimented. In the last 30, 40, 50 years, there have been incredible breakthroughs that have actually changed the way in which we understand the brain. There's a guy called Mossy, and what he showed is, you know how a CPU or in a computer, whichever chip you're using gets hotter, right? You can obviously see it. So in the brain, whichever part of the brain you're using, more blood has to go there. And then this was shown by a couple of guys, Roy and Sherrington, and then Linus Pauling, the great chemist, and Coriel showed that the oxygen-rich blood in the brain is repelled by a magnetic field. Okay, and then they were able to show that with MRI, functional MRI, it's called. With an MRI, you can see which part of the brain is active when. And then by putting people through this motion of letting them, you know, appreciate painting or do something routine or learn something, we've begun to map out the brain. And these are some of the breakthroughs that have permitted us to understand how the brain works. And so what I'm going to talk about now is some lessons from how the brain works. All right. And then I'll summarize, and I'll talk about some of the other stuff that's happening at MIT. And it's actually a very international group of people, right, who did this. But today, with functional MRI, we're beginning to really understand. It's like a microscope into the brain, how we learn and how we process. So I'm going to give you an exercise. I'm going to ask you this, and please use the chat and tell me. I'm going to give you two phrases. Which one is correct? Big black dog or black big dog? Okay. Number one. Anyone voting for number two? Anyone voting for number two? No, right? Okay. Number one is correct. Why is it correct? Let me ask you, why is it correct? Anyone? Here's the crazy thing, folks. There is a freaking, no, it's not big is a smaller word. That's not the reason, shit. It's because there's a grammatical rule. No, there's a grammatical rule. And the rule is size before color. And there's a logic to the rule. For example, if I say a silver German spoon, as opposed to a German silver spoon, it means different things. A silver German spoon means it's a German spoon because country comes last, and it's silver. German silver spoon means it's a metal. German silver is a type of metal. It's a rule that you never learned. But the crazy thing about the brain is the brain is able to infer unstated rules. Big yellow shit. I like that. Yellow big shit. See? Big yellow shit versus yellow big shit. Different meanings, right? So there is actually a real amazing rule that captures this, right? And that's a sequence of adjectives. And the adjective sequence is opinion, size, age, shape, color, origin, material, and purpose. All right? So big yellow shit, size came, that's right, okay? Anyway, so you get the idea. We are able to, exactly, Balu, we're exactly able to infer rules without ever hearing the rule, right? The brain is a crazy thing. Now, we're learning these things because of breakthroughs in understanding. A lot of our understanding of the brain actually comes from accidents and from military accidents, especially. You know, what happened was that people would walk back from or survive a artillery attack or a gunshot wound, and they would come back. My grandfather was in the Sikh regiment, 3 Sikh, and he was a doctor. And he used to tell me that after a military incident, you would see all sorts of strange behavior. So they discovered where speech comes from, they discovered where sound comes from, Broca's area, Wernicke's area, etc., etc. And so the brain is a series of organs. It's like a computer, right? But one particular man, we know his name now. His name is Henry Molaison. His name was left confidential for many years to protect his privacy. He used to get epilepsy. So in the 50s, the doctors removed his hippocampus. And suddenly they found that he could not form short-term memories. He only kept his long-term memories. And every day for the rest of his life, he would look in the mirror and say, how did I get so old? It's a crazy thing. Henry Molaison, right? Patient HM. And that's how we know the hippocampus is where memories form. And this is a bad analogy. Think of the hippocampus as the RAM. And the capacity of the RAM, 10 minutes of learning. All right? And so now we have all these crazy things. We're forming architectures of the brain, almost like a computer. The prefrontal cortex, the perihinal cortex, the parahippocampal cortex, the hippocampus subculum, right? It's still rough, but we're beginning to understand how the brain works. We understand diseases. We understand conditions like dyslexia. We understand conditions like ADHD. We can understand depression, right? We know serotonin. We know dopamine. We know how they act. And it's quite staggering, folks. It's just absolutely staggering. So there are many, 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 many principles here, right? And for example, I mentioned mind wandering, right? So I said earlier that mind wandering is when the brain is bouncing around, right? So if you look at this image, you see this? This is a state in which the brain is focused. Here is a state in which the brain is not focused. You can literally see that. After 10 minutes, the brain goes into unfocused state. All right? Okay. So a lot of lessons come from this. Ignore this graph. I'll explain this lesson very briefly. The graph is hard to explain, so forget it. Here's one lesson. And I've already violated it. More than 10 minutes of lecture, and you've lost the student. Okay, now let me ask you a question. If you're a parent, you know this. Because you know your kid will start, the eyes glaze over after 10 minutes of lecturing. Have you tried to give your child a 50-minute lecture? It becomes difficult. All right? So what do you do after 10 minutes? You back off. Right? So 10 minutes of lecturing. Here's a crazy thing. You cannot give a 10-minute lecture in a classroom because it takes 10 minutes to get people to sit down. Right? So what do? We plow on 20, 30, 45, 90, 2-hour lectures. For children and for adults, this does not work. Well, since I just violated the rule, I'm going to stop here and I'm going to use my second trick. Question. What was that organ in the brain that enables you to form short-term memories? Type into the chat. Aha, Naveen got it right. Hippocampus. Right? Sanjay remembered the hip part. I wonder why. Anyway, so the reason it's called the hippocampus, exactly, hippopotamus. It is not the hippopotamus. It is the hippocampus because it looks like a seahorse. Actually, if you look at it in an fMRI or look at dissection, it looks like a seahorse. Exactly. Now again, the prefrontal cortex is the CEO. Okay, that's the CPU. The hippocampus is the RAM. Think of it that way. Okay, it's a little bit, the analogy isn't great, but the hippocampus, exactly, the prefrontal cortex is the CEO, the hippocampus is the RAM, right? So I just applied trick number 2 to you, all right? And trick number 2 is something called retrieval learning. So after 10 minutes of lecturing, the best thing you can do, shit's going crazy here, I love it. After 10 minutes of lecturing, the best thing you can do is stop lecturing and actually go to each student and ask a personalized question, right? And you have to personalize the question a little bit. Because the act of retrieving from short-term memory, probing the short-term memory, promotes long-term memory, right? That second part, by the way, is what every parent knows also. You know, when I started this research, what I realized is that I thought, oh, all these lessons will be very clinical and boring, but actually they turn out to be surprisingly human. And they're very human in the sense that parents know how to do it, and children actually are evolved to learn that way, because human beings have evolved to be learning animals, right? The human child is basically helpless for the first 10, 15 years of their life. But on the other hand, we're highly adaptable. You can live in the Sahara, we can live in the Arctic, we can live in the jungles of India or in a desert, right? So the human beings are the most incredible learning animals. So parenting is the model for learning, actually, right? And you know this, that retrieval learning, ask questions, but it's impossible to do in a classroom, so we choose not to do it, right? Vishwa, how long does it take? So usually after a 10-minute lecture, you want to take 3 or 4 minutes at least, or preferably actually 5 to 10 minutes. Online, we can accommodate that. In person, it's very hard to accommodate that, okay? So then I'm going to tell you a third thing. Now, this is a crazy thing. What happens when a student learns something? They immediately start forgetting. What does the teacher say? You wag a finger and says, how dare you forget? That is so unfortunate. Because here's the crazy truth. The brain is evolved to forget. Let me ask you a question. When you opened a door today, do you remember the temperature of the knob? You don't, because it's irrelevant information. So the brain actually is incented to forget. It is trained to forget. What happens is that the brain forgets, but just when you're about to forget something, if you remind the person, the memory becomes much more solid. Okay, and that's what these curves show. If you look at the curve, so it's the first repetition, second repetition, third repetition. So the first time you learn something, you forget very fast. The second time, you forget slowly. It's like a low-pass filter. So the brain, if it's reminded, it says, okay, this is important, I better remember it. So forgetting is on the pathway to remembering. But we give students no chance. In fact, we make them feel like crap for forgetting. Okay. By the way, this has been recreated in worms and fruit flies. We know the neuroscientific explanation for this. It has to do with the way memories are formed. Right? Okay. So next, here's a very crazy thing. This is a poll for you. Okay. The poll is, so let us say you're learning something. All right. Let us say you're learning. Forgetting and relearning is a way to, I don't know the last word, but exactly correct, whatever that word is. Forgetting and relearning is a better way to form memories. Okay. The third piece of this is interleaved learning. So let us say I'm teaching a young, by the way, everything I've explained applies equally for old people and young people. We're the same creature, right? It's just there's subtle differences, which if you want to explain later on. So let us say I'm teaching how to calculate the surface area of a cone and how to calculate the surface area of a cylinder. By the way, does anyone remember the surface area of a cone? Anyone? 1/3 pi RH. Okay, anyway, so here's the point. So let's say I'm teaching surface area of a cone and a cylinder, and I give you problems. Should I give you cone, 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 cylinder, 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 or cone, cylinder, cone, cylinder, cone, cylinder? What do you think? Number 1 and number 2. Cone, 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 cylinder, 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 or cone, cylinder, cone, cylinder, cone, cylinder? Cone, cylinder, cone, cylinder. Chanduka says cone, cylinder, cone, cylinder. Exactly. Alternate. Exactly. You know this, but every damn textbook has a section on cones and a section on cylinders. Why? Because it's more convenient. But why do we learn from alternate? Because the brain thrives on differences. Okay? You stop noticing the temperature until the temperature changes. That's a brain thing. That's just how we work. We are a differential thing. But yet every book on every topic is organized by chapter, and the problems are organized by chapter. Nowhere have you ever seen a textbook in which the problems are mixed up? ever? In the end, you don't. Because people don't realize this stuff, right? So it turns out, by the way, this even works in sports, you know? So if you want to, if you're tennis, right? Asad may be on the YouTube channel, but Zed, you know, is a fantastic sportsman. Rohit is a fantastic sportsman. I saw Rajat is a fantastic sportsman. A lot of people here. Vishwaranjan is a fantastic sportsman. What you guys know is alternating. You know, volley, go back to the baseline. Volley, go back to the baseline. We're much better. You learn better because you learn to reload the action. If you load the action and do the same action again and again, that's not learning. It is the reloading that is the action. So in sports, they do this a lot, right? Okay, next one. Very interesting. When you learn something, the best way to actually learn it is to teach someone else. You know why? Because it's like having an open house in your brain. You have to get your shit together, pardon the expression, right? So that's called peer instruction. That is the secret of Maria Montessori or Montessori system, because kids teach each other. It's fascinating. By the way, in India, this was called the Madras system. Actually, the Europeans call it the Madras system. But in every Gurukul, in most Indian traditions, including Sufism, in Gurukuls, in Sikhism, there's a lot of peer instruction, right? And that's very profound because the teaching contributes to the learning, right? So here's another one. I can go on and on, right? Same lecture, same prof. Why did some of us learn more than other batchmates? That's a great question, Naveen, and I was one of the ones who didn't learn. I think that's kudos to the people who can learn, right? I mean, some people are very special, right? Vineet Gupta probably didn't need the professor to teach. He probably knew the stuff just by instinct, right? But different people have different abilities also, right? So if you take someone like Nadal, right, and compare him to Federer, right? Nadal has a very different style of play, but they both, I mean, when this is all done, they may end up with the same number of Grand Slams. You know, Joker is very different. Everyone is different. Shrish, I don't know what Shrish was. Shrish is very magical to me. I have never explained Shrish. I think there's a certain element of meditative strength, which I referred to earlier, that is extraordinary. I mean, I don't know. There are some things we know, my friends, and some things we don't, right? Okay, so one of the things we're learning is how the brain rewards. Very fascinating. It's called the limbic system. The limbic system creates rewards. By the way, video games take full advantage to this, full advantage of this. Yeah, R.K. Mishra asked, meditation? Yeah, meditation has been proven to control the prefrontal cortex, etc., which I talked about earlier, and I can talk more about later on. So the limbic system is fascinating. The limbic system, it's a reward function of the brain, okay? And all the gaming, all the marketing, all the Facebook crap, all the micro-marketing, micro-targeting, they take care of the limbic system. But there's something really fascinating actually about this. This is a very complicated slide, but let me just tell you what it is. So there was a professor, actually there is a professor, a very famous guy, John Gabrielli at MIT, who discovered they put EEGs on students' heads, and they gave them learning exercises. And they found that under certain circumstances, students learn fantastically, and under other circumstances, the same student learns poorly, right? And they seem to go in and out. And it's very short, actually. Those bursts are very short, the sprints. By the way, that's one of the reasons Agile works for me, right? Agile also takes advantage of a similar aspect of the brain, which is we're better off working in sprints. Okay, coming back to learning. So they figured out that under certain circumstances, students learn really well, and they could not explain why that was happening. And there was a group at UCSD that figured out why that was happening. Indian guy, actually, Chandra, I forgot his name. And you know what they found? They found that under certain circumstances, your brain, there is something called the dopaminergic circuit. The brain releases dopamine. And dopamine makes you learn better. But there's something even more profound. What releases dopamine? So I'm going to poll for you because I'm trying to break up my lecture. What is the human emotion that releases dopamine and promotes learning? Anyone? Happiness, pleasure. Anything else? The word starts with C. Exercise actually does help. Emotions, willingness, feeling good. Some dope. Curiosity. Exactly. The answer is curiosity. It's fascinating. When you're hungry, exactly, curiosity, the mouth releases saliva. When you're curious, the brain releases dopamine. By the way, joy is very interesting, Balwant. Joy is very interesting. Joy creates satisfaction, etc., which enables curiosity. If you're stressed, you can't be curious, okay? You have to be in a certain state to become curious, right? So that's also a very interesting topic. So curiosity. So what we should really be focusing on is curiosity. Students will suck up the information once you make them curious. Every parent knows this, right? So all these are lessons. And, coming back to the question of why were students able to learn really well and others not, because I can tell you for myself, I discovered my curiosity when I went to Schlumberger. Suddenly, the control theory became, now I know why it's necessary. I mean, maybe I was dumb. It didn't occur to me that it is the central element of a lot of things we do, right? Or something else, fluid mechanics. Suddenly it became enriched. It came to life. Curiosity was ignited, dopamine flowed, and really that's sort of what changed my life. Some people are blessed with not having that. And this is not to say that somehow the IIT system is horrible and the people, no, I'm just saying if you want to hit a large section of the population, you've got to appeal to all these things, right? Okay, fluid mechanics, I love that. Okay, and it goes on and on. There's lesson after lesson after lesson, self-pacing. Here's the problem with the regular lecture. If your mind wanders after 10 minutes and you miss a key topic, you've lost the whole lecture. One of the great advantages of online, which, we're in this crazy moment right now. 1.6 billion students have been separated from schools. They're doing things online and they don't like it. But if it's asynchronous, like a Khan Academy video, Sal Khan, incredible videos, right? There's, by the way, a website, 3 Blue, 1 Brown on YouTube. Watch it. He's brilliant. A, they explain things beautifully. And B, you can go back. You can pause and rewind and you can self-pace. It turns out to be very fundamental. Every lecture ignores this fundamental concept, right? Some people integrate differently. Some people need to connect the dots differently, right? Don't judge them. Give them a chance. We have the technology now, right? Multiple reinforcements for retention. That's exactly right. And again, I'll come back to that actually if you remind me. Here's the crazy thing. Intent makes a difference. So there's a crazy experiment they did. They showed 2 groups of students videos of how to assemble a certain toy, right? And to the first group, this is randomized. They say, the toy is outside the room if you want to assemble it. That's it. That's all they say. The first group learns better. End of story. Intent. Intent matters, right? When I went to work in industry, suddenly I had intent, right? For a lot of us, came into IIT, we survived, right? And intent is a question. RK, I'll talk to you. That's a good question. That's actually a whole conversation about whether online is good for students. Okay. The third is embodied cognition. This one is fascinating. You remember angular momentum, folks? How many of you remember angular momentum? All right. Bicycle wheel. If you spin a bicycle wheel, you do this, it does that. Get a gyroscopic moment. Okay. So a randomized controlled trial done by a very eminent colleague at the University of Chicago. She's now the president of Barnard College in Columbia. What she did was she taught 2 students. I don't remember the exact numbers, but I'll give you sort of a paraphrasing. One group, they learn angular momentum for 1 hour, and for half an hour they play with a spinning bicycle wheel, and they have to twist the wheel, and the wheel, you feel the gyroscopic moment. The second group, they learn angular momentum for 90 minutes, and they don't actually play with the spinning bicycle wheel. Yes, angular momentum is equal to I omega, right? Now, which group learns better? One group is 60 minutes of lecture, 30 minutes of playing with the bicycle wheel. Second group is 90 minutes of lecture. Which one learns better? Absolutely group 1. And now we know why. You know why? It's because when you play with your hands, the motor cortex gets activated. And the motor cortex is like a coprocessor to the brain. In fact, the MIT learning philosophy is mens et manus, mind and hand, right? IIT, Kanpur, our IIT was set up by MIT colleagues, and so we got that. That was good, right? ESC2X, yeah, that's good too. By the way, some of you may remember Crandall Dahl, Lardner. So when I came to MIT, Crandall was still here. If I touched his feet, it would look really bad, so I went and said hi to him. I mean, he wouldn't have understood. There's more and more, right? We're learning about cognitive load. For example, for a novice, fill-in-the-blank problems are fantastic. For those of us who took lecture plus practical, for those of us who did Agarwal's or Brilliant's, there's a lot of fill-in-the-blanks problems. But when you become an expert, you should give more open-ended problems. So when we became experts to take, JE level problems, right, or whatever, right? And then you have to match what is called the cognitive load. The cognitive load has to be matched to the capacity of the student. Every sports coach knows this. Every tennis coach knows this. Every soccer coach knows this. Every sport, every running coach knows this. Weightlifting, right? You don't give someone a 200-pound weight to bench press if they can't bench press 100 pounds. And getting that just right is very difficult. Lectures, we screwed up completely in our education system. But you know what? Online does that really well. Like Rosetta Stone applies a lot of these principles. Duolingo, Babbel, they all apply. Yeah, Ankil, you can have my presentation. Absolutely. Right? I'll skip over these slides, but just to show you that you can, in my lab and labs at MIT, we're doing experiments with EEG. By the way, I'm not a neuroscientist, right? I'm a mechanical engineer and do a lot of instrumentation. So I'm actually telling you what I am seeing from the outside. R.K. Mishra, Sanjay Subhash is called Ankil, long story. So we are doing these experiments, and you can see mind wandering, you can see learning, you can see. And by the way, the improvement in learning, if you look at this graph here, is not like 2%, right? It's 25%, 30%, and it's like compound interest. So if you compound the learning stage after stage, topic after topic, it's extraordinary how much better the learning can be. I started off by saying I have never seen the sizzling intellect I saw at IIT. I never saw that at MIT, right? And actually coming into IIT, we all got our funda straight. But somehow, once we got into IIT, some people kept their funda straight, the super geniuses. I was lazy, I was a fatru, and things started to crumble, right? But if you apply these tricks, you can, should, and will keep your funda straight, right? That's the basic idea. And there's another lesson number 27. That's a joke, but there's like 50 lessons, right? This is called Deliberate Practice. There's a great book about this by this guy, Anders Ericsson. I recommend it. It's called The Science of Expertise, Peak. It turns out coaching makes all the difference. So what you want to do is set incremental goals and coach the person through the goals, right? And in great universities, this stuff happens, right? In different universities, in the regular universities where most of humanity goes, there's very little coaching. Nagendra, you said interpolated is equal to change the topic. That's interleaved, not interpolated. Right, okay. So the problem with a lot of these lessons is we simply ignore them because they're inconvenient, and we plow along in teaching. That is wrong. As super intelligent, highly accomplished, my brothers and sisters from IIT, your kids are probably in college or in school. It's not too late. Your instincts as parents, I hope you're able to convey to them, because education should be closer to parenting and learning should be closer to childhood. And this applies to you even as adults. And you know this as an adult. You don't have the luxury or the patience to sit through a 1-hour lecture. So you adapt, right? You watch quickly. So now I'm going to, sorry for the typo, why is this so important today? I'm going to speak for a few more minutes and then I'll end. So this is important today because the world is changing. We come from a world of companies, big companies, Jamshedpur. The company came together because it was cheaper to have one to put a factory where everyone produced things together, to have a typist's pool. So what I show there is a typist's pool, right? So if you have to a contracting office, right? And then, so that's how the company came together. Ronald Coase got the Nobel Prize for 2 papers. One he wrote in the 30s and one he wrote to the 60s for explaining why the firm was formed, the theory of the firm. And then the firms became bigger and bigger, and they even started building cities like Jamshedpur, the company town, and the company became the benevolent overlord. And we all became animals of the companies, right? Yes, R.K. Mishra says about genius. In fact, I'll make a comment about that, right? But I'll come back to that. So that was the heyday, but something has changed dramatically. And this is pre-COVID. This is pre-COVID. So if you look at the acceleration of industries to the right, you can see how fast new technologies have been adopted. Compare that to the left, right? You see how slowly telephone got adopted. And then compare it to how quickly cell phones and smartphones got adopted. So what's happening is that the reason companies were created was because of transaction costs. That's what Ronald Coase got the Nobel Prize for. So to type a document, you needed a typist. It's hard to find a typist, so it's better to form a company and have a typist's pool, and you gave the job, and then some typist did it for you, and you got it back. But now with things like Google Docs, with freelancing and e-lancing, and two-sided markets like Uber and Airbnb, right? Or for Upwork, what has happened is the reasons to accumulate everything and create one big company are vanishing. Right? Now COVID hits and companies can't get big. So the e-lancing industry, the Ubers, the Instacarts are going to, of course, Uber has a infection problem, but leaving that aside, the gig economy is going to take off even more, right? Even more rapidly, even more dramatically and irreversibly. Now, what does this mean? This means that a lot of corporate jobs are going to go away on the one hand. And again, pre-COVID, this is before 36 million unemployment claims in the United States due to COVID, right? And on the other hand, entire industries are going to get wiped out. So retail is dying. It's a technology industry I've been involved in for a long time. I'm absolutely devastated by I'm talking about bricks and mortar retail by COVID. But on the other hand, things like Amazon are going to win it, right? So what that means is we may be reaching peak employment. In fact, we may be past peak employment. Okay? More and more of us are not going to work for companies. And by the way, this is the recovery time from previous recessions. This is the 2007 recession, right? It took a very long time to return. And now we have COVID. That's going to be a very long time returning. And companies are not going to grow, right? E-commerce, Rahul Avasti says, growing 30% post Corona. By the way, the middle class is vanishing. That's the other crazy thing. So that means the low-end jobs are going up and the high-end jobs are going up. But the middle jobs are going away. More AI, more automation, more robotics, right? So where will your kids end up, right? So what I call it is the disruption of the individual. So we trained people in universities to work for a company. Right? But today, more and more, if you look at this, are self-employed. UK, United States, and India also, right? Many of us, in fact. I mean, as a professor, of course, I'm employment, but a lot of my work is consulting. And what that means is the future of your kids, and even yourselves, is you have to become the CEO of your own life. Right? You're the sales, marketing, health, career counselor of your own life, inventor, innovator, fundraiser, everything. And then COVID hit, right? And the new normal, which is economic downturn, global trade shifts, industries wiped out, everyone's working from home. And this is our new reality, right? Now, in the interest of time, I'm going to do the next couple of slides very quickly. I won't bore you with them. Just to say that, actually, I'm going to skip the slide, sorry. I'm going to skip this slide. Okay, I'll share all my slides with you. I'm going to share these slides with you. But let me just show this slide and then one more slide and I'll end. So in the old world, this comes to R.K. Mishra's question as well. We had an orchestra in the world of only 2 instruments. The orchestra was the real world, where you worked. And the vast majority of people, don't, it's changing, but just work in the real world, right? A little urchin in a village outside Delhi doesn't once they graduate, even they may not even go to school, right? or you went to college for a couple of years, you got a master's, and you moved on. That's all you could do. But what's happening now is, and by the way, in the US, we have a third approach, which is two-year college, which is called, it's like going to, what's it called in India, IITTI or something, right? Or in the US, community college. That's about it, outside of high school. What's happened now is we have three instruments in the orchestra. We have the working world, you have online, and you have residential. And what it's created is a much richer set of options. Micro degrees, credentials, online programs, blended programs, boot camps, etc., etc. And what I wanted to say is it's like a new form of music. With all these things, we can play a new form of music where education and work are interleaved. The mode of education and the mode of work are interleaved. And so at MIT, this is sort of how I got into all this. So in 2000, MIT created something called OpenCourseware. Actually, my wife, Gitanjali, whom many of you know, also IIT Kanpur, is contributed to the creation of OpenCourseware. And we reached something like 500 million people. We gave our curriculum for free to the world, and many of your kids probably have seen OpenCourseware. Then we established something called MITx, and we created a platform called edX with Harvard and MIT and Harvard invested in edX. And MITx, which reports to me, OpenCourseware reports to me, we've reached 4 million students. And edX has recently crossed 100 million enrollments, right? edX is a non-profit. Coursera is a for-profit created by a couple of Stanford professors, both of whom I know. And Udacity is a third company which is sort of related. So those are the three behemoths in the space. So this is the program I lead, and that's the reason we're doing all this. And I got into all this, I'll end with the next couple of slides, is because about 10 years ago, I was asked to lead the setup of a new university in Singapore called the Singapore University of Technology and Design, SUTD. And we started from scratch. The university is up and running now, beautiful campus. And in setting it up, I started looking into what is learning. I looked at my own experiences. And that's why I did all this research. And in my view, everything has to change based on what I've said. Lectures, labs, curriculum, assessment, the way in which students access this education, VR, AR. It's a matter of time before Siri and Amazon Echo are playing a part in education. Education and play are like Scratch, or by the way, that's the inventor of Scratch over there, or Lego Mindstorms. That's all. He also invented Lego Mindstorms, or FIRST Robotics. All that stuff becomes this continuum where we create, where you create this this learning experience. Ankil. All right, so. They started some centers at MIT to look at the future of learning. That's basically what led to my book. Second last slide. Unfortunately, it's sort of interesting. Every time there's a new technology, people talk about all the things that will change. By the way, this picture from the 1930s talks about e-commerce. And it took almost 70 years until Amazon was founded for it to really take off, right? So the idea here is this lady is cooking and she's looking at the screen and she's speaking on this phone, and that person is selling stuff and you buy it, right? It's very interesting. It's like QVC, but now we do e-commerce. But I think with education, with everything else changing, we don't redefine it, then we will get left behind. And I think that actually education is going to become essential. I think we all know this in our jobs. AI from 3 years ago is not what AI is today, right? And the sheer capability of technology, the fact that Sandy could put together this incredible program with this company to do, this conferencing. These are all examples of the incredibly rapidly changing, agile nature of education and our ability and need to keep up with it. So I'll stop there. So the book is coming out in August, but thank you very much, Vishwaranjan, for instigating us, and thank you, Sandy, Rohit, and everyone for setting this up and for pushing me to do this. But really a pleasure to see you all, and I'm hoping that this is how our family can stay together in the months and years ahead. So thank you, and I'm at your service.